You usually assume that knowing is something you possess. You say, "I know," as if knowing were an activity performed by a separate someone. You imagine yourself as a center that observes an outer world. This structure feels natural. It feels unquestionable, yet a quiet paradox appears. If knowing belongs to you, how do you know that you know? And who is the one who confirms this knowing? Ibn Arabi challenged this entire framework. He did not treat knowing as a personal function. He suggested that knowing is not owned by individuals at all. He suggested that knowing is a fundamental mode of reality itself. You think you have knowledge. But what if knowing is what you are made of? What if knowing could exist without a separate someone who knows? Ibn Arabi emerged within the intellectual world of Islamic metaphysics, where scholars examined existence, causality, and divine reality with great precision. Many thinkers focused on defining God as an object of belief and describing humans as separate knowers who must approach that divine object through correct doctrine and practice. Ibn Arabi did not deny religious forms, but he questioned the metaphysical assumptions beneath them. His central concern was not mystical experience in the emotional sense. It was ontology. What exists, and how is existence known? He argued that much religious thinking quietly assumed a split between divine knowing and human knowing. God knows absolutely. Humans know partially. Ibn Arabi asked whether this division reflected reality itself or reflected conceptual habit. He proposed that knowing does not belong exclusively to God on one side and to humans on the other. Knowing, in his view, belongs to being itself. This idea unsettled theological structures because it dissolved a foundational hierarchy. If knowing is not owned by separate entities, then the line between divine and human knowing becomes less rigid. Why would dissolving this boundary be considered dangerous? You automatically assume a basic structure. There is you. There are objects. Knowing happens when information travels from objects to you. This model seems obvious. It is reinforced by language. I see a tree. I hear a sound. I understand an idea. Each sentence implies a subject, receiving data from an external source. But look carefully. Every piece of knowledge you have ever had appears as a thought, a sensation, a memory, a recognition. All of these appear within awareness. You never encounter knowledge outside awareness. You never step outside awareness to retrieve it. Yet the mind imagines that knowledge comes from outside. It imagines a bridge between world and self. This imagined bridge creates the sense of being a separate knower. This structure is habitual. It feels natural because it has been repeated for years. But habit does not equal truth. Does the subject-object model describe how reality actually functions? Or does it describe how thought organizes experience? Notice something simple. Every time you know something, that knowing appears as experience. A thought arises. A recognition occurs. A conclusion forms. You never catch knowing in transit. You never observe knowledge traveling toward you. There's only the appearance of knowing. Even when you read a sentence, what appears is not an external sentence entering you. What appears is an internal experience of meaning. This suggests something subtle. Knowing is not a delivery system. It is not a transport mechanism. It is an appearance within awareness. If all knowing appears within awareness, then awareness is not a container that receives knowing. Awareness is the field in which knowing shows up. This quietly reverses the usual Assumption. You thought awareness belonged to you. You thought knowing belonged to awareness. But what if awareness and knowing are not two things? Does knowing truly move toward you? Or does it simply appear as what you already are? Ibn Arabi proposed a radical idea. Existence is not a blind substance. It is not an inert matter waiting to be observed. Existence is inherently knowing. In his view, being and knowing are not separate. Being is not first, with knowing added later. Being is knowing. This means reality is not something that needs a knower in order to be known. Reality knows itself by being itself. This is not mystical poetry. It is metaphysical logic. If knowing required an external knower, that knower would require another knower to knows, and so on endlessly. To avoid infinite regress, knowing must be self-sufficient. Ibn Arabi concluded that knowing is intrinsic to existence. It is not a feature possessed by individuals. Individuals are expressions within knowing. Could knowing be anything other than being's own activity? You feel like a knower. This feeling seems undeniable. But examine it. Can you find the knower as an object? Not a thought about a knower. Not a sense of being a knower. But the knower itself. You find thoughts. You find sensations. You find mental images. You do not find a separate entity behind them. The sense, I know, appears as a thought. That thought refers to an owner. But reference is not proof. Language creates grammatical subjects. It does not guarantee metaphysical subjects. The idea of an inner knower functions as a useful convention. It simplifies communication, but it may not describe what actually exists. If no independent knower can be found, then knowing is not an action performed by someone. It is an activity without an owner. If that is true, who claims ownership of knowing? Ordinary thinking assumes that knowing requires distance. There must be a knower here and a known there. But consider the implications. If distance were required for knowing, you could never know your own existence, because you cannot stand outside your existence to observe it. Yet you do know that you exist. This knowledge is immediate. It is not mediated by distance. Ibn Arabi emphasized that the deepest knowing is not representational. It is not about something. It is identity. Being knows itself by being itself. No gap is involved. Distance appears only at the level of conceptual thought. Thought divides experience into categories: knower, knowing, knowing. But these divisions arise after knowing. They do not produce knowledge. Is distance a condition for knowing? Or is distance a concept added afterward? If knowing belongs to reality itself, many structures lose their ultimate authority. No institution can claim exclusive access to truth. No group can claim metaphysical superiority. No individual can claim to be the sole knower. Teachings become provisional. Guidance becomes functional. This does not eliminate tradition. It removes absolutism. Historically, systems of power depend on controlling access to truth. If knowing is inherent to being, control becomes impossible at the deepest level. This is why such ideas have often been labeled dangerous, not because they promote chaos, but because they dissolve metaphysical ownership. When knowing is undivided, authority must be justified practically, not cosmically. Who benefits from keeping knowing divided? You may notice discomfort when the idea of undivided knowing appears, not because it threatens survival, but because it threatens identity. Identity depends on being someone, a knower, a thinker, an experiencer. If knowing is not owned, the central role collapses. The mind interprets this as annihilation. But nothing functional disappears. Thinking continues. Learning continues. Responding continues. What disappears is a story about ownership. The resistance is not moral. It is structural. The self is built out of reference points. Undivided knowing removes the ultimate reference point. What remains when the knower dissolves? Life does not become abstract when ownership dissolves. You still think. You still decide. You still learn. But the sense of authorship softens. Thoughts arise. Understanding happens. Responses occur. None of this requires a central owner. Responsibility remains. Actions still have consequences, but guilt loses metaphysical weight. Pride loses metaphysical weight. There is no cosmic owner to reward or punish. There is only one process. This produces simplicity, not because problems vanish, but because unnecessary layers dissolve. Is life less coherent when knowing is not possessed, or more coherent? You began with the assumption that knowing belongs to you. You end with a question about whether knowing ever belonged to anyone. Knowing has never been owned. Knowing has never been separate. Knowing is what reality is doing. The idea of a knower was a useful fiction. The idea of possession was a conceptual convenience. Nothing essential has been lost. If knowing is what exists, who was ever separate from it?